Okay, so this is lecture 2 for chapter 6, and today we're going to be looking at fingerprint characteristics. So fingerprint characteristics are named for their general visual appearance and ridge patterns. General fingerprint patterns include loops, where ridges enter and exit from the same direction, and this type of pattern includes about 65% of the population. A whorl looks like a bullseye with the ridges entering and exiting from opposite directions, and about 30% of the population have whorl fingerprints. An arch has ridges that enter from one side of the finger and leave from the other side with a rise in the center, and this includes about 5% of the population. So here's a picture of a loop, and you can kind of see how the ridges come in from the left side and loop around and exit from that same direction. Here's a picture of a whorl, and you've got ridges coming in from the left side as well as the right side, creating that whorl pattern. And then arches also have ridges that come in from either side, but instead of making a circular path or pattern, they rise in the center and then just kind of go back down there. So each basic fingerprint pattern, a loop, whorl, or arch, has variations among their overall structure known as differentiation patterns. Determining these patterns helps to further distinguish between two people who have the same general pattern, such as two individuals with a whorl pattern fingerprint. So let's look at some differentiation patterns of loop fingerprints. The right radial loop is a loop that opens or curves toward the thumb on the right hand. A right ulnar loop is when the loop opens or curves toward the pinky on the right hand. So the radius is the bone in the forearm that is thumb side, whereas the ulna is the bone in the forearm that is pinky side. So a left radial loop is the loop that opens or curves toward the thumb on the left hand, and this actually looks very similar to the right radial loop on a surface on a piece of paper. And a left ulnar loop is a loop that opens or curves toward the pinky on the left hand, and this resembles the right ulnar loop on any surface. So loop patterns will always have a core and a delta. The core is the center of a loop. So here it's kind of colored in red. That's known as the core of a loop pattern. And a delta is a triangular ridge pattern that is formed kind of by three ridges coming together and forming this little triangular shape. A ridge count may also help distinguish one loop fingerprint from another. So to take a ridge count, an imaginary line, which here is shown in yellow, is drawn from the center of the core to the middle of the delta. The number of ridges between the core and delta becomes the ridge count. So if we counted these ridges, we'd see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I would say that the ridge number of this loop is 5. Okay, so let's look at some whorls, different whorl patterns. So a plain whorl is a whorl that will have one or more ridges that make a complete concentric circle. And plain whorls always have two deltas. So here's a plain whorl, and you can see the ridges coming in from either side. And due to that kind of whorl pattern in the center and the ridges that are entering from either side, you get these two kind of triangle shapes. Those are the deltas. A central pocket loop whorl will have one or more ridges that make a complete circle within a loop pattern. So essentially this whorl is tucked into the pocket of the loop, and that's why we call it a central pocket loop whorl. And this type of whorl pattern also will have two deltas, just kind of in a different placement. So it'll have one delta outside of the loop, kind of like you have here in the regular or plane whorl. And then you'll also have another delta kind of formed within the loop where the actual whorl begins. A double loop whorl is made up of two separate loop formations that spiral around each other. And again, this type of pattern will have two deltas. And what I like to think of is the double loop whorl kind of makes an S shape or a yin-yang symbol. This can often be confused with a single loop, so you have to pay close attention to the number of loops present. And this can also be confused with an accidental whorl. So an accidental whorl pattern is a combination of two other patterns, such as a double loop whorl and a central pocket loop whorl. And this can have two or more deltas. So here's an example of an accidental whorl, and you can see it actually has 3 delta patterns. And I like to think that an accidental whorl usually looks kind of like a small tree or a mushroom type of pattern. So you see that, okay, maybe it does kind of have 2 loops here, but they're not separate from each other. They actually kind of combine to make a whorl that kind of has the shape of a bean. And so that's how you can tell that that's not going to be a double loop whorl or a plane whorl. That's going to be an accidental whorl. So here's another image of a plane whorl. If you look closely, you can find, okay, there's one delta there, and there's the second delta over here. Central pocket loop whorl has a delta over on the left side, and depending on the way the loop is going, that could be on the opposite side as well. And then there's another delta right here where the whole whorl starts to form. And then you can see the loop that enters from the right side, circles around that whorl, and then exits from the right side as well. Double loop whorl, again, looks like an S here, and you've got a delta here and a delta here. And here is an accidental whorl. So we've got 1 delta, 2, and 3 kind of over here in this area. Okay, so let's look at differentiation patterns of arches. So a plane arch has ridges entering from one side, rising in the center, and exiting the other side of the fingerprint. And a plane arch will have a more rounded hill appearance and should have 0 deltas. So here's a plane arch, really just has that kind of rounded rise in the center, and there are no deltas because there are no sharp edges. A tented arch has ridge patterns entering one side, rising in the center and exiting out the other side. However, it will appear more pointed than a plane arch with a mountain or tent appearance, and there will be 1 delta in the center of the arch. So here is a tented arch, has a really steep incline on either side, and there is your delta. So the tented arch is often kind of confused with a loop pattern because a loop pattern really does have this kind of delta here where you've got the steep incline. However, with a loop, the ridges won't go up and over the ridge. Instead, they'll kind of loop back around on one side of that delta. So that's how you can determine the difference between those two things. So here's a plane arch. Again, you don't have any deltas. It's got that very rounded hill appearance. And here is a tented arch with the delta right here in the center and that really steep incline with the ridges going up and over the arch. Okay, so once you have determined the general pattern, plane, loop, or whorl, and then you've determined the differentiation pattern between those 3 different types of patterns, you can start to look at the very tiny, minute details of the fingerprint. So while looking at the basic fingerprint patterns can quickly help exclude a suspect, In order to consider a print found at a crime scene consistent with that of an individual, more information is often needed. So minutiae are the combination of details in the shapes and positions of ridges and fingerprints that makes each unique, also sometimes referred to as ridge characteristics. There are approximately 150 individual ridge characteristics on the average full fingerprint. Recognizing minutiae and the differences between ridges, their relative number, and their location on a specific fingerprint is called fingerprint identification. So here are about 10 different ridge patterns or minutia patterns that help us analyze fingerprints and further narrow down the suspect. The first one is a ridge ending, which is just an abrupt ending of a ridge. So in this example, you have 3 ridges, and we are assuming that these are continuous ridges, and this one is ending here. A bifurcation is a single ridge that divides into 2 ridges. This is also sometimes called a fork, kind of like a fork in the road. So you've got this single ridge that splits into 2. And it's not always going to be such a large angle here. Sometimes it's very slight, but it's the same thing. It's still a bifurcation or fork. An island ridge is a ridge that commences, travels a short distance, and then ends. This is also sometimes called a short ridge. So again, you've got 3 different ridges here. We're assuming that these 2 are just continuous, and you can see this short ridge here in the center. So this is really what you need to focus on. If you have a short ridge below a bifurcation, it's still considered a short ridge. It doesn't have to have these 2 continuous ridges surrounding it. A dot ridge is very similar to an island ridge. It's just a very short island ridge that often appears as a simple dot on a fingerprint. A bridge is a short ridge that runs between 2 parallel ridges. So a bridge is literally connecting 2 other ridges that are running next to each other. A spur or a hook is a bifurcation with a short ridge branching off of a longer ridge. So you've got that bifurcation, right, where the single ridge forks or splits into 2 ridges. However, one of those ridges continues running, whereas the other one stops. And so you kind of have this little hook appearance there. An eye is a single ridge that bifurcates and reunites shortly after to continue as a single ridge. This can also be called an enclosure or an island. I don't really like to call it an island because it can often be confused with the island ridge, but an eye is a really good description for it because it looks kind of like an eye, and you've got that kind of full circle there. A double bifurcation is a single ridge that splits into 2 ridges, with one of those ridges also bifurcating. So here's your double bifurcation. You've got a single ridge that breaks into 2, and then that one also splits into 2. So 2 bifurcations. A delta is a Y-shaped ridge meeting that often forms a triangular shape. So we looked at deltas earlier. They're kind of considered a special minutia pattern because you find them in many different types of prints usually, and depending on the number of deltas there, it can help you determine between different differentiation patterns of fingerprints. So this image isn't great, but it kind of shows you how you do have this little triangle shape or delta. And then the last one is the trifurcation. This is a single ridge that divides into 3 ridges. So tri for 3, which you can kind of see there.